dead travel fast. Da-da-da-da. 'Tis now the very witching time of night, when churchyards yawn and hell itself breathes out contagion to this world. Doesn't that sound like Poe or something? That's Hamlet. That's Shakespeare. That's Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2. When churchyards yawn and hell itself breathes out contagion to this world. The grave. Yeah. Where no one wants to be, but, well, everyone will go, eh? Or will they? Will everyone go to the grave and then stay put? Well, there's the rub, isn't it? Restless spirits abound, from those who cannot go to their rest to those who will not, and some poor souls who didn't even know they were scheduled for departure. Oh, there's no one crankier than someone rudely awakened on the wrong side of the dirt, believe me, I know. And tonight, my brave hearts, we begin our seasonal ventures abroad into exploring the obscure, exhuming Gothic tales and more seasonal delights. Now, correct me when I'm wrong, but when one hears the name Lenore, one might be inclined to recall Edgar Allan Poe, who famously mourned that rare and radiant maiden. Yes, but some half-century earlier, mine Bürger told a celebrated carol of another Lenore. This is, in fact, one of the earliest pieces of texts containing references to the undead in European literature. It became quite famous in its day and became part of literary textbooks for many Gothic authors, including Bram Stoker and Edgar Allan Poe. In the ballad, it is the year 1648. The Battle of Prague is over. William, the fiancé of a young woman named, drum roll please, a young woman named Lenore, the fiancé of William. William has not yet returned from war, and when the warriors return without William, Lenore begins to curse God. She begins complaining about his unfairness and proclaiming that he has never done her any good, which prompts her mother to ask for her daughter's forgiveness because she knows that such a thought is blasphemous and will condemn sweet Lenore to hell. Lenore's mother also suggests that William probably found another woman in Hungary and Lenore should just forget him anyway. But then Lenore receives a letter from William. That he wrote and sent to her from faraway Bohemia. He writes that he will soon come to take her away. And then, at midnight, yes, that very witching time of night, a mysterious stranger who looks like William knocks on the door, dunk, 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 and asks Lenore to accompany him on horseback to their marriage bed. Lenore happily gets on the stranger's black steed, and the two ride off at a frenetic pace under the moonlight along a path filled with eerie landscapes. Terrorized, Lenore demands to know why they are riding so fast, to which William responds that the dead travel fast. Die Toten reiten schnell. Lenore demands that William leave the dead alone. Lass sie ruhen die Toten. At sunrise, their journey ends, and they arrive at the cemetery's gates. As the horse wanders through the tombstones, William begins to lose his human appearance, and is revealed as death, a skeleton with a scythe and an hourglass. The marriage bed is shown to be the grave where, together with his shattered armor, William's skeleton lies. The ground beneath Lenore's feet begins to crumble, and the spirits dancing in the moonlight surround the dying Lenore, declaring that no one is to quarrel with God in heaven. So, let's give the ballad a listen, shall we? Up rose Lenore as the red moon wore. From weary visions starting, art faithless, William, or William, art thou dead? 'Tis long since thy departing. For he with Frederick's men of might in fair Prague waged the uncertain fight. Nor once had he writ in the hurry of war, and sad was the true heart that sickened afar. The empress and the king, with ceaseless quarrel tired, at length relaxed the stubborn hate which rivalry inspired. And the martial throng with laugh and song spoke of their homes as they rode along, and clank, clank, clank came every rank, with the trumpet sound that rose and sank. Here and there and everywhere along the swarming ways went old man and boy with the music of joy on the gallant bands to gaze. And the young child shouted to spy the wayward, and the trembling and blushing the bride pressed forward. But for the sweet lips of Lenore, the kiss and the greetings are vanishing o'er. From man to man all wildly she ran with a swift and searching eye, but she felt alone in the mighty mass as it crushed and crowded by. On hurried the troop, a gladsome group, and proudly the tall plumes wave and droop. She tore her hair and she turned her round, and madly she dashed her against the ground. Her mother clasped her tenderly with soothing words and mild. My child, may God look down on thee, God comfort thee, my child. O mother, mother, gone is gone. I reck no more how the world runs on. What pity to me does God impart? Woe, woe, woe for my heavy heart. Oh, heaven, help her, heaven, and favor her. Child, utter an Ave Maria. Wise and great are the doings of God, he loves and pities thee. Out, mother, out on the empty lie. Doth he heed my despair? Doth he list to my cry? What boots it now to hope or to pray? The night is come, there is no more day. Help, heaven, help, who knows the Father, knows surely that he loves this child. The bread and the wine from the hand divine shall make thy tempered grief less wild. O mother, dear mother, the wine and the bread will not soften the anguish that bows down my head. For bread and for wine it will yet be as late that his cold corpse creeps from the grim grave's gate. What if the traitor's false faith failed, by sweet temptation tried? What if in distant hungry he clasps another bride? Despise the fickle fool, my child. Who hath taken the pebble and spurned the pearl? While soul and body shall hold together, in his perjured heart shall be stormy weather. Oh, mother, mother, gone is gone, and lost will still be lost. Death, death is the goal of my weary soul, crushed and broken and crossed. Spark of my life, down, down to the tomb. Die away in the night, die away in the gloom. What pity to me does God impart? Woe, woe, woe for my heavy heart. Help, heaven, help, and heed her not. For her sorrow so strong within, she knows not the words that her tongue repeats. Oh, count them not for sin. Cease, cease, my child, thy wretchedness, and think on the promised happiness. So shall thy mind's calm ecstasy be hope, and a home, and a bridegroom to thee. My mother, what is happiness? My mother, what is hell? With William is my happiness, without him is my hell. Spark of my life, down, down to the tomb, die away in the night, die away in the gloom. Earth and heaven and earth, reft of my William, are nothing worth. And thus grief racked and tore the breast of Lenore, and was busy at her brain. Thus rose her cry to the power on high, to question and arraign, wringing her hands and beating her breast, tossing and rocking without any rest. Till from her light veil the moon shone through, and the stars leapt out on the darkling blue. But hark to the clatter and the pat-pat-patter of a horse's heavy hoof. How the steel clanks and rings as the rider springs, how the echo shouts aloof. While slightly and lightly the gentle bell tingles and jingles softly and well. And low and clear through the door plank thin comes the voice without to the ear within. Hola, hola, unlock the gate. Art waking my bride or sleeping? Is thy heart still free and still faithful to me? Art laughing, my bride, or weeping? Oh, wearily, William, I've waited for you, woefully watching the long day through, with a great sorrow sorrowing for the cruelty of your tarrying. Till the dead midnight we saddled not. I have journeyed far and fast, and hither I come to carry thee back, ere the darkness shall be past. Oh, rest thee within till the night's more calm. Smooth shall thy couch be, and soft and warm. Hark to the winds, how they whistle and rush through the twisted twine of the hawthorn bush. Through the hawthorn bush let the whistle and rush. Let whistle, child, let whistle. Mark the flash fierce in the high of my steed's bright eye, and his proud crest eager bristle. Up, up and away, I must not stay. Mount swiftly behind me, up, up and away. and 100 miles must be ridden and sped ere we may lie down in the bridal bed.
What? 100 miles tonight? By thy mad fancies driven, dost hear the bell with its sullen swell as it rumbles out 11?
Look forth, the moon shines bright. We and the dead gallop fast through the night. 'Tis for a wager I bear thee away to the nuptial couch ere break of day.
Where is the chamber, William dear? And William, where is the bed? Far, far from here, still narrow and cool, plank and bottom and lid.
Hast room for me? For me and thee, up to the saddle right speedily. The wedding guests are gathered and met, and the door of the chamber is open and set. She bussed her well into the cell, and she sprang with nimble haste, and gently smiling with a sweet beguiling, her white hands clasped his waist. Ah, hurry, hurry, ring, 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 to and fro they sway and swing, snorting and snuffing they skim the ground, and the sparks spread up and the stones run round. Here to the right and there to the left flew fields of corn and clover, and the bridges flashed by to the dazzled eye as rattling they thundered over. What ails my love? The moon shines bright, bravely the dead men ride through the night. Is my love afraid of the quiet dead?
Ah, no, let them sleep in their dusty bed.
On the breeze cool and soft, what tune floats aloft while the crows wheel overhead? Ding dong, 'tis the sound, 'tis the song. Room, room for the passing dead. Slowly the funeral train drew near, bearing the coffin, bearing the bier, and the chime of their chaunt was hissing and harsh like the note of the bullfrog within the marsh. You bear your corpse in the dark midnight, with hymns and bells and wailing. But I bring home my youthful wife to a bride feast rich regaling. Come, chorister, come with thy choral thong, and solemnly sing me a marriage song. Come, friar, come, let the blessing be spoken, that the bride and the bridegroom's sweet rest be unbroken. Died the dirge and vanished the bier, obedient to his call. Hard, hard behind with a rush like a wind, came the long steps pattering fall, and ever further ring, 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 to and fro they sway and swing, snorting and stuffing they skim the ground, and the sparks spurt up and the stones run round. How flew to the right, how flew to the left, tree, mountains in the race, how to the left and round, right and left, flew town and marketplace. What ails my love? The moon shines bright, bravely the dead men ride through the night. Is my love afraid of the quiet dead?
Ah, let them alone in their dusty bed.
See, 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 by the gallows tree as they dance in the wheel's broad hoop, up and down in the gleam of the moon, half lost in airy group. Ho, ho, mad mob, come hither amain, and join in the wake of my rushing train. Come dance me a dance, ye dancers thin, ere the planks of the marriage bed close us in. And hush, 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 the dreamy rout came close to the ghastly bustle, like the whirlwind in the hazel bush when it makes the dry leaves rustle. And faster, faster, ring, ring, ring. To and fro they sway and swing, snorting and snuffing they skim the ground, and the sparks spurt up and the stones run round. How flew the moon high overhead, and the wild race madly driven, in and out, how the stars danced about and reeled over the flashing heavens. What ails my love? The moon shines bright, bravely the dead men ride through the night. Is my love afraid of the quiet dead?
Alas, William, let them sleep in their dusty bed.
Horse, horse, meseems 'tis the cock's shrill note, and the sand is well nigh spent. Horse, horse, away, 'tis the break of day, 'tis the morning's air sweet scent. Finished, finished is our ride. Room, room for the bridegroom and the bride. At last, we have reached the spot, for the speed of the dead man has slackened not. And swiftly up to an iron gate, with reins relaxed they went. At the rider's touch the bolts flew back, and the bars were broken and bent. The doors were burst with a deafening knell, and over the white graves they dashed pell-mell. The tombs around looked grassy and grim as they glimmered and glanced in the moonlight dim. But see, and an eyelid's beat, to who a ghastly wonder, the horseman's jerkin piece by piece dropped off like brittle tinder. Fleshless and hairless, a naked skull, the sight of his weird head was horrible. The lifelike mask was there no more, and the scythe and the sandglass the skeleton bore. Loud snorted the horse as he plunged and reared, and the sparks were scattered round. What man shall say if he vanished away or sank in the gaping ground? Groans from the earth and shrieks in the air, howling and wailing everywhere. Half dead, half living, the soul of Lenore fought as it never had fought before. The churchyard troop, a ghostly group, close round the dying girl. Out and in they hurry and spin to the dance's weary whirl. Patience, patience, when the heart is breaking. With thy God there is no question making. Of thy body thou art quit and free. Heaven keep thy soul eternally. That's the Ballad of Lenore by Mine Ear Bürger. Now, the preceding ballad is considered by many to be a precursor to the vampiric and the undead genre of literature. And we mentioned earlier Lenore as a prelude to our next delight, Dracula's Guest. Now, Dracula's Guest was written by none other than Bram himself. Now, this tale is considered to be the expurgated first chapter of Mr. Stoker's mighty novel, Dracula. So if you're like me, you have not heard this before. Well, I have now, but I hadn't until kind of recently. Anyway, Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. When we started for our drive, the sun was shining moonily. Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. When we started for our drive, the sun was shining brightly on Munich, and the air was full of the joyousness of early summer. Just as we were about to depart Delbruck, the maitre d'hotel of the Quatre Seasons where I was staying, Delbruck came down bareheaded to the carriage, and after wishing me a pleasant drive, he said to the coachman, still holding his hand on the handle of the carriage door, "Remember, you are back by nightfall. The sky looks bright, but there's a shiver in the north wind that says there may be a sudden storm. But I am sure you will not be late." Here he smiled and added, "For you know what night it is." Johann answered with an emphatic, "Ja, mein Herr," and touching his hat, he drove off quickly. When we cleared the town, I said, after signaling him to stop, "Tell me, Johann, what is tonight?" Johann crossed himself as he answered laconically, "It is Walpurgis night, sir." Now, briefly, medieval and Renaissance tradition held that during Walpurgis night, the evil powers are at their strongest. To ward off evil and protect themselves and their livestock, people would light fires on the hillsides. In Bavaria, to celebrate this holiday, revelers dress as witches and demons. They set off fireworks. They dance and play loud music, which is said to drive the witches and winter spirits away. So that's a quick recap for everybody except Rick of what Walpurgis night is. My driver, Johann, then took out his watch, a great old-fashioned German silver thing as big as a turnip, and looked at it, with his eyebrows gathered together and a little impatient shrug of his shoulders. "I savage." I realized that this was his way of respectfully protesting against the unnecessary delay, and sank back in the carriage, merely motioning him to proceed on. He started off rapidly, as if to make up for lost time. Every now and then the horses seemed to throw up their heads and sniff the air suspiciously. On such occasions I often looked up round in alarm. The road was pretty bleak, for we were traversing a sort of high, wind-swept plateau. As we drove, I saw a road that looked but little used, and which seemed to dip through a little winding valley. It looked so inviting that, even at the risk of offending him, I called Johann to stop, and when he had pulled up, I told him I would like to drive down that road. Well, he made all sorts of excuses and frequently crossed himself as he spoke, and this somewhat piqued my curiosity. So I asked him various questions. He answered fencingly and repeatedly looked at his watch and protest. Finally, I said, "Well, Johann, I want to go down this road. I shall not ask you to come unless you like, but tell me why you do not like to go. That's all I ask." For answer, Johann seemed to throw himself off the box of the carriage, so quickly did he reach the ground. Then he stretched out his hands appealingly to me, and he implored me not to go. Now, there was just enough of English mixed in with the German for me to understand the drift of his talk. He seemed always just about to tell me something, the very idea of which evidently frightened him. But each time he pulled himself up, saying as he crossed himself, Walpurgis Nacht! Walpurgis Nacht! I tried to argue with him, but it was difficult to argue with a man when I did not know his language. The advantage certainly rested with him, for although he began to speak in English, a very crude and broken kind, he always got excited and he broke into his native tongue. And every time he did so, he looked at his watch. Then the horses became restless and sniffed the air. At this he grew very pale, and looking around in a frightened way, he suddenly jumped up. He took them by the bridles, and he led them on some 20 feet. I followed and asked why he had done this. For answer, he crossed himself. He pointed to the spot we had left and drew his carriage in the direction of the other road, indicating a cross, and said, first in German, then in English, buried him. Him what killed themselves. Now, thanks to my friendship with Sam and Dean, I remember the old custom of burying suicides at crossroads. Ah, I see, a suicide, how interesting. But for the life of me, I could not make out why the horses were frightened. Whilst we were talking, we heard a sort of sound between a yelp and a bark. It was far away, but the horses got very restless, and it took Johann all this time to quiet them. He was pale, and he said, sounds like a wolf, but there are no wolves here now. No, I said, questioning him. Isn't it long since the wolves were so near the city? Long, yes. In the spring and summer. With the snow, the wolves have been here not so long. It's maybe the last season, 15, I think. Whilst he was petting the horses and trying to quiet them, dark clouds drifted rapidly across the sky. The sunshine passed away, and a breath of cold winds seemed to drift past us. It was only a breath, however, and more in the nature of a warning than a fact, for the sun came out brightly again, and Johann looked under his lifted hand at the horizon and said, the storm of snow, there's a storm of snow, he comes before long time, man. Then he looked at his watch again, and he strayed away, holding his reins firmly, for the horses were still pawing the ground restlessly and shaking their heads. He climbed to his box, as he thought the time had come for proceeding on our journey. Now, I can't say why, but I felt a little obstinate, and I did not at once get into the carriage. Tell me, I said, about this place where the roads lead, and I pointed down. Again, he crossed himself, and he mumbled a prayer before he answered, It is unholy, ja. What is unholy? I inquired. The village. Then there is a village. No one lives there, hundreds of years now. My curiosity was piqued. But you said there was a village. There was. Where is it now, Johann? Whereupon he burst out into a long story in German and English, so mixed up that I could not quite understand exactly what he said. But roughly I gathered that long ago, hundreds of years, men had died there and been buried in their graves. And then sounds were heard under the clay. When the graves were opened, men and women were found rosy with life, their mouths red with blood. And so in haste to save their lives, aye, and their very souls, and here he crossed himself, those who were left fled away to other places, where the living lived and the dead were dead and not something else. He was evidently afraid to speak the last words. As he proceeded with his narration, he grew more and more excited. It seemed as if his imagination had got a hold of him now, and he ended in a perfect paroxysms of fear, white-faced, perspiring, trembling, looking round him, as if expecting that some dreadful presence would manifest itself there in the bright sunshine of the open plain. Finally, in an agony of despair, he cried out, Walpurgis Nacht! Walpurgis Nacht! And he pointed to the carriage for me to get in. All my English blood rose at this, and standing back I said, You are afraid, Johann. You are afraid. Go home. I shall return alone. The walk will do me good. The carriage door was open. I took from the seat my oak walking stick, which I always carry on my holiday excursions, and I closed the door, pointing back to Munich, and said, Go home, Johann. Walpurgis Nacht does not concern Englishmen. The horses were now more restive than ever. Johann was trying to hold them in, while excitedly imploring me not to do anything so foolish. Honestly, I pitied the poor fellow. He was deeply in earnest, But all the same, I could not help laughing. His English was quite gone now. In his anxiety, he had forgotten that his only means of making me understand was to talk my language, and so he jabbered away in his native German. I began to be a little tedious. After giving the direction, "Home!" I turned, and I went down the crossroad into the valley. With a despairing gesture, Johann turned his horses toward Munich. I leaned on my stick and I looked after him. He went slowly along the road for a while. Then there came over the crest of the hill a man tall and thin. I could see so much in the distance. When he drew near Johann and the horses, they began to jump and kick about and then to scream with terror. Johann could not hold them in. They bolted down the road, running away madly. I watched them out of sight. Then I looked for the stranger. I found that he, too, was gone. With a light heart, I turned down the side road through the deepening valley to which Johann had objected. Now, there was not the slightest reason that I could see for his objection, and I dare say I tramped for a couple of hours, without thinking of time or distance, and certainly without seeing a person or a house. So far as the place was concerned, it was a desolation itself. But I did not notice this particularly until, on turning a bend in the road, I came upon a scattered fringe of wood, and then I recognized that I had been impressed unconsciously by the desolation of this region through which I had passed. I sat down to rest myself. I began to look around. Now, it struck me that it was considerably colder than it had been at the commencement of my walk. A sort of sighing sound seemed to be around me, and with now and then high overhead a sort of muffled roar. Looking upwards, I noticed that thick clouds were drifting rapidly across the sky from north to south at a great height. There were signs of a coming storm in some lofty stratum of the air. True, I was a little chilly, and thinking that it was the sitting still after the exercise of walking, I resumed my journey. Now, the ground I passed over was now much more picturesque. There were no striking objects that the eye might single out, but in all there was a charm of beauty about it. I took little heed of time, and it was only when the deepening twilight forced itself upon me that I began to think how I should find my way home. The brightness of the day had gone. The air was cold. The drifting of clouds high overhead was more marked. They were accompanied by a sort of far-away rushing sound, through which seemed to come at intervals that mysterious cry which the driver had said came from a baby werewolf. I'm not sure he said that. I think he just said a wolf. For a while I hesitated. I had said that I would see the deserted village, and so on I went. Presently there came a wide stretch of open country, shut in by hills all around. Their sides were covered with trees which spread down to the plain, dotting in clumps the gentler slopes and hollows which showed here and there. I followed with my eye the winding of the road, and I saw that it curved close to one of the densest of these clumps, and was lost behind it. As I looked, Losi appeared, and there came a cold shiver in the air, and the snow began to fall. I thought of the miles and miles of bleak country I had passed, and then hurried on to seek the shelter of the wood in front. Darker and darker grew the sky, and faster and heavier fell the snow. To the earth before and around me was a glistening white carpet, the further edge of which was lost in the misty vagueness. The road was here but crude, and when on level its boundaries were not so marked as when it passed through the cuttings. In a little while I found that I must have strayed from the road, for I missed underfoot the hard surface. My feet sank deeper into the grass and moss. Then the wind grew stronger and blew with ever-increasing force, till I was fain to run before it. The air became icy cold, and in spite of my exercise I began to suffer. The snow was now falling so thickly and whirling around me in such rapid eddies that I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every now and then the heavens were torn asunder by vivid lightning, and in the flashes I could see overhead me a great mass of trees, chiefly yew and cypress, all heavily covered with snow. I was soon amongst the shelter of the trees, and there, in comparative silence, I could hear the rush of the wind high overhead. Presently the blackness of the storm had become merged in the darkness of the night. By and by the storm seemed to be passing away, and now only came in fierce puffs or blasts. At such moments the weird sound of the wolf appeared to be echoed by many similar sounds around me. Now and again, through the black mass of drifting cloud came a straggling ray of moonlight which lit up the expanse and showed me that I was at the edge of a dense mass of cypress and yew trees. As the snow had ceased to fall, I walked out from the shelter and began to investigate more closely. It appeared to me that amongst so many old foundations as I had passed, there might still be standing a house, though in ruins, in which I could find some sort of shelter for a while. As I skirted the edge of the copse, I found that a low wall encircled it, and following this I presently found an opening. Here the cypresses formed an alley leading up to a square mass of some kind of building. Just as I caught sight of this building, however, the drifting clouds obscured the moon, and I passed up the path in the darkness. The wind must have grown colder now, for I felt myself shiver as I walked. But there was the hope of shelter, and I groped my way blindly on. I stopped, for there was a sudden stillness. The storm had passed. Perhaps in sympathy with nature's silence, my heart seemed to cease to beat. But this was only momentarily, for suddenly the moonlight broke through the clouds and showed me that I was in a graveyard, and that the square object before me was a great massive tomb of marble, as white as the snow that lay on and all around it. With the moonlight there came a fierce sigh of the storm, which appeared to resume its course with a long, low howl of the many dogs or wolves. I was awed and shocked, and I felt the cold perceptibly grow upon me till it seemed to grip me by the heart. While the flood of the moonlight still fell on the marble tomb, the storm gave further evidence of renewing, as though it was returning on its track. Impelled by some sort of fascination, I approached the sepulchre to see what it was, and why such a thing stood alone in such a place as this. I walked around it, and I read over the Doric door in German. Countess Dollingen of Glatz in Styria. Sought and found death, 1801. And on the top of that tomb, driven through the solid marble, for the structure was composed of few vast blocks of stone, was a great iron spike. On going to the back, I saw graven in great Russian letters, Motiai Kalataresk Repede. The dead travel fast. See, and there's that reference to the ballad Lenore that we began our evening with. The dead travel fast. Motiai Kalataresk Repede. Now there was something so weird and uncanny about the whole thing that it gave me a turn and made me feel quite faint. I began to wish for the first time that I had taken Johann's advice, especially on this Walpurgis night. Walpurgis night, when, according to the belief of millions of people, the devil was abroad. When the graves were opened and the dead came forth and walked. When all evil things of earth and air and water held revel. This very place the driver had specially shunned. This was the depopulated village of centuries ago. This was where the suicide lay and where I stand. This was the place where I was alone, unmanned, shivering with cold in the shroud of snow with a wild storm gathering upon me. I took all my philosophy, all my religion I had been taught, all my courage not to lapse into a paroxysm of fright. And now a perfect tornado burst upon me. The ground shook as though thousands of horses thundered across it. And this time the storm bore on its icy wings not snow, but great hailstones, which drove with such violence that they might have come from the thongs of Balearic slingers. Hailstones that beat down leaf and branch and made the shelter of the cypresses of no more avail than though their stems were standing corn. At first I had rushed to the nearest tree, but I was soon fain to leave it and seek the only spot that seemed to afford any refuge at all, the deep Doric doorway of the marble tomb. And there, crouching against the massive bronze door, I gained a certain amount of protection from the beating of the hailstones, for now they only drove against me as they ricocheted from the ground and the side of the marble. As I leaned against the door, it moved slightly and opened inwards. The shelter of even the tomb was welcome in that pitiless tempest, and I was about to enter it when there came a flash of forked lightning that lit up the whole expanse of the heavens. In the instant, as I am a living man, I saw, as my eyes were turned into the darkness of that tomb, I saw a beautiful woman, with rounded cheeks and red lips, seemingly sleeping on a bier. As thunder broke overhead, I was grasped as by the hand of a giant, and I was hurled out into that storm. The whole thing was so sudden that before I could realize the shock, moral as well as physical, I found the hailstones beating down upon me. At the same time, I had a strange, dominating feeling that I was not alone. I looked towards the tomb, and just then there came another blinding flash, which seemed to strike that iron stake that surmounted the tomb, and to pour through to the earth, blasting and crumbling the marble as in a burst of flame. The dead woman rose for a moment of agony while she was lapped in those flames, and her bitter scream of pain was drowned in the thunder crash. The last thing I heard was his mingling of dreadful sound, as again I was seized in the giant's grasp, and I was dragged away, while the hailstones beat upon me, and the air around seemed reverberant with a howling of wolves. The last sight that I remembered was a vague white moving mass, as if all the graves around me had sent out the phantoms of their sheeted dead, and that they were closing in on me through the white cloudiness of the driving hail. Gradually, there came a sort of vague beginning of consciousness, and then a sense of weariness that was dreadful. For a moment I remembered nothing, but slowly my senses returned. My feet seemed positively racked with pain, yet I could not move them. They seemed to be numbed. There was an icy feeling at the back of my neck and all down my spine and my ears, like my feet were dead, yet in torment. But there was on my breast a sense of warmth which was by comparison delicious. This was as a nightmare, a physical nightmare, if one may use such an expression, for some heavy weight on my chest made it difficult for me to breathe. This period of semi-lethargy seemed to remain a long time, and as it faded away I must have slept or swooned. And then there came a sort of loathing, like the first stage of seasickness, and a wild desire to be free from something, I knew not what. A vast stillness then enveloped me, as though all the world were asleep or dead, only broken by the low panting as of some animal close to me. I felt a warm rasping at my throat. Then came a consciousness of the awful truth, which chilled me to the heart and sent blood surging through my brain. Some great animal was lying on me and now licking my throat. I feared to stir, for some instinct of prudence bade me lie still. But the brute seemed to realize that there was now some change in me, for it raised its head. And through my eyelashes I saw above me the two great flaming eyes of a gigantic bear. No, a gigantic wolf. Its sharp white teeth gleamed in the gaping red mouth, and I could feel its hot breath fierce and acrid upon me. For another spell of time I remembered no more. Then I became conscious of a low growl, followed by a yelp, renewed again and again. Then seemingly from very far away I heard a "Hello! Hello!" as of many voices calling in unison. Cautiously I raised my head and I looked in the direction whence the sound came, but the graveyard blocked my view. The wolf still continued to yelp in a strange way, and a red glare began to move around the grove of the cypresses as though following the sound. As the voices drew closer, the wolf yelled faster and louder as if calling them. I feared to make either sound or motion. Nearer came the red glow over the white pall which stretched into the darkness around me. Then all at once from beyond the trees there came at a trot a troop of horsemen bearing torches. The wolf rose from my breast and made for the cemetery. I saw one of the horsemen, soldiers by their caps and their long military cloaks. I saw him raise his carbine and take aim. A companion knocked up his arm, and I heard the ball whiz over my head. He had evidently taken my body for that of the wolf. Another sight of the animal as it slunk away, and a shot followed. Then at a gallop the troop rode forward, some towards me, others following the wolf as it disappeared amongst the snow-clad cypresses. As I drew nearer, I tried to move, but I was powerless. Although I could see and hear all that went on around me, 2 or 3 of the soldiers jumped from their horses and knelt beside me. One of them raised up my head and placed his hand over my heart. "Good news, comrades," His heart still beats. Aye, then some brandy was poured down my throat to put vigor into me, and I was able to open my eyes fully and look around. Lights and shadows were moving among the trees, and I heard the men call to one another. They drew together, uttering frightened exclamations, and the lights flashed as the others came pouring out of the cemetery pell-mell like men possessed. When the further ones came close to us, those who were around me asked them eagerly, "Well, have you found him?" The reply rang out hurriedly, "No, no, come away, quick, quick. This is no place to stay, and on this of all nights." "What was it?" was the question, asked in all manner of keys. The answer came variously and all indefinitely, as though the men were moved by some common impulse to speak, and yet were restrained by some common fear from giving their thoughts. It indeed," gibbered one, whose wits had plainly given out for the moment. "It was a wolf, and yet not a wolf." "No use trying for him without the sacred bullet," a third remarked in a more ordinary manner. Yes, and then Rick and Kira would be really mad if we killed it anyway. But that would serve us right for coming out on this night. Truly we have earned our 1,000 marks," were the ejaculations of a fourth. There was blood on the broken marble," another cried after a pause. "The lightning never brought that there. And for him, is he safe? Look at his throat. See, comrades, the wolf has been lying on him and keeping his blood warm." The officer looked at my throat and replied, "He is all right. The skin is not pierced. What does it all mean? We should never have found him but for the yelping of that wolf." "Yet what became of that wolf?" asked the man who was holding up my head, who seemed the least panic-stricken of the party, for his hands were steady without tremor. On his sleeve is a chevron of a petty officer. It went to its home," answered the man, whose long face was pallid, and who actually shook with terror as he glanced around him fearfully. "There are graves enough there in which it might lie. Come, comrades, come quickly. Let us leave this accursed spot." The officer raised me to a sitting posture. As he uttered a word of command, then several men placed me upon a horse. He sprang to the saddle behind me, he took me in his arms, and he gave word to advance, and turning our faces away from the cypresses, we rode away in swift military order. As yet my tongue refused its office, and I was perforce silent. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I remembered was finding myself standing up, supported by a soldier on either side of me. It was almost broad daylight, and to the north a red streak of sunlight was reflected like a path of blood over the waste of the snow. The officer was telling the men to say nothing of what they had seen, except that they found an English stranger guarded by a large dog. "Dog! That was no dog!" cut in the man who exhibited such fear. "I think I know a wolf when I see one." The young officer answered calmly, "I said a dog, sir." "Dog! Ha!" reiterated the other ironically. It was evident that his courage was rising with the sun, and pointing to me, he said, "Look at his throat. Is that the work of a dog, master?" Instinctively I raised my hand to my throat, and as I touched it I cried out in pain. The men crowded around to look, some stooping down from their saddles. Again there came the calm voice of the young officer. "A dog, as I said, sir. If aught else was said, we should only be laughed at." As I was then mounted behind a trooper, and we rode on into the suburbs of Munich. Here we came across a stray carriage into which I was lifted, and was driven off to the Quatre Saisons, the young officer accompanying me, whilst a trooper followed with his horse, and the others rode off to their barracks. When we arrived, the maitre d', Herr Delbruck, rushed so quickly down the steps to meet me that it was apparent he had been watching within. Taking me by both hands, he solicitously led me in. The officer saluted me and was turning to withdraw when I recognized his purpose and insisted that he should come to my rooms. Over a glass of wine, I warmly thanked him and his brave comrades for saving my life. He replied simply that he was more than glad, and that Herr Delbruck had at first taken steps to make all the searching party pleased, at which ambiguous utterance the maître d'hôtel smiled, while the officer pleaded duty and withdrew. But, forgive me, but Herr Delbruck, I inquired,
How and why was it that the soldiers searched for me? He shrugged his shoulders as if in deprecation of his own deed. As he replied, I was so fortunate as to obtain leave from the commander of the regiment in which I served to ask for volunteers. How did you know that I was lost? I demanded. The driver came hither with the remains of his carriage, which had been upset when the horses ran away. But surely you would not send a search party of soldiers merely on this account. Oh, no. But even before the coachman arrived, I had received a telegram from the Count. He took from his pocket a telegram, which he handed to me, and I read, From Bistritz. Give care to my friend. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him and ensure his safety. He is English and therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow and wolves at night. Lose not a moment if you suspect harm to him. I answer your zeal with my fortune. Signed, Count Dracula. As I held the telegram in my hand, the room seemed to whirl around me. And if the attentive maître d'hôtel had not caught me, I think I should have fallen. There was something so strange in all this, something so weird and impossible to imagine, that there grew on me a sense of my being in some way the sport of opposite forces, the mere vague idea of which seemed in a way to paralyze me. I was certainly under some form of mysterious protection from someone I had never met or even heard of. From a distant country had come, in the very nick of time, a message that took me out of the danger of the snow sleep in the jaws of the wolf. And yet the name Dracula somehow rang familiar in my astonished mind, as of a premonition, of something yet to come, but remembered only dimly from a dream. And so, though it is never quite revealed how Dracula became aware of Jonathan Harker in the first place, for this was indeed Jonathan Harker, this is their first interaction, which, of course, is continued in the novel Dracula, as we commonly know it. So, real quick to wrap up, here is an excerpt from the first chapter of Dracula. Jonathan Harker has been summoned to Dracula's home. We join him and the other passengers aboard the coach. The driver lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, with wild cries of encouragement urged them to further exertions. Then through the darkness I could see a sort of patch of grey light ahead of us, as though there were a cleft in the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its great leather springs and swayed like a boat tossed on a stormy sea. Left, right, left, right, left. For those making maps, I want to make sure I included that. I had to hold on. The road grew more level, and we appeared to fly along. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and to frown down upon us. We are entering on the Bürger Pass. As we flew along, the driver leaned forward on each side of his passengers, craning over the edge of the coach, peering eagerly into the darkness. It was evident that something very exciting was either happening or expected, but though I asked each passenger, no one would give me the slightest explanation. This state of excitement kept on for some little time, and at last we saw before us the pass opening out onto the eastern side. There were dark rolling clouds overhead, and in the air the heavy oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and that now we had gotten into the thunderous one. I was now myself looking out for the next conveyance, which was to take me alone on to the Count. Each moment I expected to see the glare of lamps through the blackness, but all was dark. The only light was the flickering rays of our own lamps, in which the steam from our hard-driven horses rose in a white cloud. We could now see the sandy road lying white before us, but there was on it no signs of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had best do, when the driver, turning to me, spoke in German worse than my own. There is no carriage here. The heir is not expected after all. He will now come on to Bukovina, and return tomorrow and the next day. Better the next day. Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so the driver had to hold them up. And then amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants and a universal crossing of themselves, a caleche with 4 horses drove up behind us and overtook us and drew up beside the coach.
I could see from the flash of our lamps as the rays fell on them that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals, and they were driven on by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight as he turned to us. He said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend." The man stammered in reply, "The English air was in a hurry," to which the stranger replied, "That is why, I suppose, you wished him to go on to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled. The lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth, with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth as white as ivory. One of my companions whispered to another the line from Bürger's Lenore, "Den dein Toten reiten schnell," for the dead traveled fast. "Den dein Toten reiten schnell." The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passengers turned his face away, at the same time putting out his 2 fingers and crossing himself. "Give me the heir's luggage," said the driver. With exceeding alacrity, all my bags were handed out and put into the calèche, and then I descended from the side of the coach as the calèche was close alongside, the driver helping me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength was prodigious and brought to mind that iron grasp that had seized me the day before during the hailstorm at the Countess Dullingen's crypt in Styria. Without a word, he shook his reins. The horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the past. As I looked back, I saw the steam from the horses of the coach with the light of the lamps, and projected against it the figures of my late companions crossing themselves. Then the driver cracked his whip and called to his horses, and off they swept on their way to Bukovina. As they sank into the darkness, I felt a strange chill and a lonely feeling come over me. But a cloak was thrown over my shoulders, and a rug across my knees, and the driver said something in excellent German. "The night is chill, mein Herr. My master, the Count, bade me take all care of you. There's a flask of Schlivitz," that's the plum brandy of the country, "Schlivitz, underneath the seat if you should require it." Now, I did not take any of it. What? Plum brandy, and he didn't drink any. Oh my God, this is a horror tale. I did not take any of it, but it was a comfort to know it was there all the same. I felt a little strangely and not a little frightened. I think had there been any alternative, I should have taken it, instead of prosecuting that unknown night journey. The carriage went at a hard pace straight along, and then we made a complete turn and went along another straight road. It seemed to me that we were simply going over and over the same ground again, so I took note of some salient point and found that this was so. I would have liked to have asked the driver what all this meant, but I really feared to do so, for I thought that, placed as I was, any protest would have had no effect in case there had been an intention to delay. By and by, however, as I was curious to know how time was passing, I struck a match, and by its flame I looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, for I suppose the general superstition about midnight was increased by my recent experiences. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in the farmhouse down the road, a long, agonized wailing as if from fear. And the sound was taken up by another dog, and then another, till borne on the wind which now sighed softly through the pass, a wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it through the gloom of the night. At the first howl, the horses began to strain and rear, but the driver spoke to them soothingly, and they quieted down, but shivered and sweated as though after a run away from a sudden fright. And then far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of us, began a louder and sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way, for I was minded to jump from the calèche and run, whilst they reared again and plunged madly, so that the driver had to use all his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was able to descend and to stand before them. He petted them and smoothed them and whispered something in their ears. Now I have heard of horse tamers doing this with extraordinary effect, for under his caresses they became quiet, manageable again, though they still trembled. The driver again took his seat, and shaking his reins, he started off at a great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass,
he suddenly turned down a narrow roadway which ran sharply to the right. Soon we were hemmed in with trees, which in places arched right over the roadway till we passed through a tunnel. And again, great frowning rocks guarded us boldly on either side. And though we were in shelter, we could hear the rising wind, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still, and fine powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered with a white blanket. The keen wind still carried the howling of the dogs, though this grew fainter as we went on our way. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing around on us from every side. I grew dreadfully afraid, and the horses shared my fear. The driver, however, was not in the least disturbed. He kept turning his head to left and right and right and left and left and right and left, but I could not see anything through the darkness. And suddenly, away on our left, I saw a faint, flickering blue flame. The driver saw it at the same moment. He at once checked the horses, and jumping to the ground, he disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to do, the less as the howling of the wolves grew closer. But while I wondered, the driver suddenly appeared again, without a word, took a seat, and we resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly, and now looking back, it's like a sort of awful nightmare. Once that blue flame appeared so near the road that even in the darkness around us I could watch the driver's motions. He went steadily to see where the blue flame arose, and it must have been very faint, for it did not seem to illumine the place around it at all now, and gathering a few stones formed them into some device. Once there appeared a strange optical effect. When he stood between me and the flame, he did not obstruct it, for I could see its ghostly flicker all the same. This startled me, but as the effect was only momentary, I took it that my eyes deceived me through the straining darkness. And then, for a time, there were no blue flames, and we sped onwards through the gloom, with the howling of the wolves around us, as though they were following in a moving circle. At last there came a time when the driver went further afield than he had yet gone, and during his absence the horses began to tremble worse than they ever had, to snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for it, for the howling of the wolves had ceased altogether. But just then, the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a beetling pine-clad rock, and by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves, white teeth and lolling red tongues and long sinewy limbs and shaggy hair. They were 100 times more terrible in the grim silence which held them than even they when they howled. For myself, I felt a sort of paralysis of fear. It is only when a man feels himself face to face with such horrors that he can understand their true import. All at once the wolves began to howl, as though the moonlight had had some peculiar effect upon them. The horses jumped about and reared, and I looked helplessly round with eyes that rolled in a way painful to see. But the living ring of terror encompassed them on every side, and they had perforce to remain within it. I called to the coachman to come, for it seemed to me that our only chance was to try to break out through the ring and to aid his approach. I shouted, and I beat the side of the caleche, hoping by the noise to scare the wolves from the side, so as to give him a chance of reaching the trap. How he came there I know not, but I heard his voice raised in a tone of imperious command, and looking towards the sound saw him stand in the roadway. As he swept his long arms, as though brushing aside some impalpable obstacle, the wolves fell back, and back further still. And then a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, so we are again in the darkness. And when I could again see, the driver was climbing into the caleche, and the wolves disappeared. Now, this was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me, and I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept on our way, now in almost complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. We kept on ascending, with occasional periods of quick descent, but in the main always ascending. Suddenly I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line across the sky.